Hello and welcome to our Church History in Greater Depth course. We're going in the first half of this course to be looking at the Continental Reformation. But to get that in its right understanding, its right context, we need to look at the centuries before first. And so that's what this first session is going to be about. The late Middle Ages, an age of anxiety. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was struck by a series of crises which challenged the way people thought about the world, changed how society was structured, and paved the way for the challenge to the authority of the Church, which we find in the Reformations of the 16th century. Perhaps the first of these was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Now this is 200 years before Luther's insights, but it was part of a series of events which led to a very anxious society, including one anxious young man in a thunderstorm in the early 16th century, but more of him later. Now famines were not uncommon in Europe. In a society where farming is predominantly subsistence farming with little surplus, one bad harvest means people go hungry. But a widespread famine means that even those who have money to afford to trade for food will find it hard to import what they need. Now, from 1300 to 1500, England was one of the most prosperous parts of Europe, in part because of the number of sheep and the production of wool. Just take a moment to think about what evidence we have of that prosperity today. But even England was subject to famine in 1531, 1551, 1369, as well as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This famine was probably caused by climate change. Not man-made climate change as we have now. In this case, it was the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. In the 1250s, Atlantic pack ice began to grow. This may have been triggered by a massive volcanic eruption of the Samalas volcano in 1257. This is in the Philippines, but it had an international impact. It was one of the largest eruptions in the Holocene period, the geological period we're now in. This period began 13,000 years ago, and that's the end of the last ice age. And as far as geologists are concerned, it's still going on. This volcanic eruption was 8 times stronger than the Krakatoa eruption. The eruption put a vast amount of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. Over an area of 400 kilometres square, deposits of 3 centimetres or more have been found from this eruption. Now such cloud blocks out the sun and reduces the temperature. This ash has been found in ice cores 8,500 kilometres away from the volcano. So from that we know that much of the world was affected by this decrease in temperature. So the ice didn't melt much as usual in the summer. You get a growth in the ice caps, which reflect more of the sun's light. Other impacts due to the increased amount of other chemicals in the atmosphere all added up to a decrease in summer temperature of about 0.7 to 1.2 degrees C. Now, the change in temperature and the increase in ice volume also altered ocean currents, which meant that some areas were worse affected than others. But all in all, this climate change lowered temperatures for many years to come. That had an impact on crop growth. The preceding warm period, larger harvests had been possible, and so the population grew. In Britain, well, we know the figures, the population grew from about 1.5 million, as recorded by the Domesday Book, to about 4 million in 13,000. But from 1260 on, the winters were more severe, leading to death from cold and winter illnesses, and the summers were cooler, leading to a lower yield in the harvests. And this came to a head in 1315, when it just kept on raining and raining and raining. This was perhaps started by another volcano, this time in New Zealand. But either way, it stayed cool and wet, and the grain didn't ripen in 1315. It carried on raining, so salt couldn't be evaporated out of brine. Meat could not be preserved for the winter. It was raining, so hay and straw could not be dried out for winter feed, so the animals died. In the spring of 1316, it was still raining, and all levels of society were exhausted. Wheat was now about 300% the cost of what it had been for those with money left to buy, 3 times as expensive. But most people were subsistence farmers, living on what they grew. They had nothing left. They foraged for nuts, grasses and bark in the forests. They ate their seed grain and slaughtered and ate their animals. And still it rained. Children were abandoned. The Hansel and Gretel trope in fairy tales may well have come from this period. Old people chose not to eat to leave food for the younger people. Through the summer of 1316, this autumn, winter and spring, it rained or snowed. People died of pneumonia. Food stocks were non-existent. People starved. In the summer of 1317, the sun shone. But it was too late for many people. It took until 1325 for the food supply to recover to what it had been before the famine, and between 10 to 25% of the population died across the British Isles, northern France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Germany and western Poland, the areas most affected. What impact do you think this had on the remaining people? And what impact do you think it had on the church? And on crime levels, for that matter?